So in today's video, I am going to be discussing the Chiefs' biggest needs heading into this year's draft. Now, before we get into the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and let's jump right into the video. So for the Chiefs, I have three positions that I think they really need to focus on heading into this year's draft. Now, obviously, other positions you would love to add some depth, like the offensive line. The Chiefs have a great offensive line right now, but I'm sure they would love to add some depth just in case we have an issue where maybe we have issues at right tackle where people are injured throughout the season. So always adding a little bit of depth, I think the Chiefs would love to do. But I think there are three main positions that the Chiefs absolutely have to address in this year's draft. And the first position the Chiefs have to address in this year's draft is pass rush, defensive line, edge rusher, whatever you want to call it. But pass rush is the biggest thing that the Chiefs have to address in this year's draft. And I think that's a consensus among all Chiefs fans. I think the Chiefs have to address their defensive line. It was not good last year. It ranked 29th in sacks and it had 31 total sacks last season. So it really did struggle to get home to the quarterback. It was their biggest liability all of last year. And with it being the biggest liability, the defensive line is a defense's best friend. You can have an average secondary, and if you have a very good defensive line, it's going to help out the entire team. And with the Chiefs, that never really happened last year. The defensive line was so bad last year that they were asking guys who could not stay in coverage, like Daniel Sorensen, for example, somebody like that who can't stay in coverage for more than a few seconds. They were asking them to stay in coverage for a long time, and it felt like the only time the Chiefs were getting sacks were coverage sacks, which, in my opinion, is not a good thing. I think coverage sacks, as great as they are, that's a good thing for your secondary. It's not a good look for the defensive line. And I think the defensive line, like I said, it was a big liability. It hurt, I think, the entire defense. It definitely hurt the secondary at time. Like I said, they had to defend way longer than they should have on certain plays throughout the entire season. You had Chris Jones, who in my opinion had zero help all of last year. Chris Jones led the team with 9 sacks, and the next closest was Frank Clark with 4.5 sacks. Now with Frank Clark in the offseason, they were able to restructure his contract, so I think that was a good thing. But at the same time, the Chiefs didn't really make any moves during free agency on the defensive line, which kind of really stinks, because for me, that was the biggest thing the Chiefs needed to address this offseason, and they really didn't address it whatsoever. And I think they have pieces on the team right now that are okay for depth, but they don't have any quality starters on this team. Now, I still think Frank Clark is a starter, and obviously Chris Jones is a starter. He's one of the top defensive tackles in the NFL right now. Like, there's no question about that. But I think Chris Jones is really the only guy on that defensive line. While I do think Frank Clark is starter quality, I think the Chiefs need to get another quality pass rusher, and I think it'll help out that entire defensive line. It'll help out Chris Jones a little bit, because teams, right, it seemed like the only guy they were worried about was Chris Jones. It'll help out Frank Clark a little bit. Maybe it'll free him up a little bit, because then you add, hopefully in the draft, an elite level or a very good pass rusher, and it'll just free up the entire defensive line where guys can go in there and make some plays. So that's obviously, the defensive line is a big liability for the Chiefs, because I think it got exposed in the AFC Championship game against the Bengals, because going into that game, the Bengals had one of the worst offensive lines in football, and the Chiefs were only able to get 1 sack on him. Now, I understand it's football. Things happen every single game that are different, but going into a game against the worst offensive line in football and you're only getting 1 sack, that's kind of worrisome, in my opinion. That's not good. That's not a good look, especially when Joe Burrow was sacked 19 times in these playoffs, and the Chiefs only got 1 of those. So that's not a good look. And when they were getting home, they weren't able to finish plays. So the Chiefs as a whole, they definitely need to work on that defensive line. It's the biggest liability for the Chiefs right now, and it's their number 1 position I think they have to address in this year's draft. The next position that I think the Chiefs have to address is wide receiver. They need more wide receiver depth, but more than importantly than just wide receiver depth, they need an actual wide receiver one ever since they traded Tyreek Hill to Miami. Now, with the offseason move of adding Juju when Tyreek Hill was on the team, I loved the move, and I thought the Chiefs were in a really good position. But once you trade away Tyreek Hill, you obviously needed a wide receiver one. Now, with Juju on the team, I would presume that he would probably be the number 1 wide receiver on the team right now. While that doesn't sound like the end of the world, I don't know. I'm still kind of on the fence of how I would feel about Juju being the number one option on this team. And to be honest, if I'm being 100% honest, I think the number one option right now would probably be Travis Kelce, and he's our tight end. But then you also run into the issue that with Travis Kelce being our number one target right now, and Tyreek Hill being gone, I think teams are just going to take Travis Kelce out of every single play right now, and that'll just leave Juju, MVS, and Hardman to make plays. Well, I love the depth the Chiefs have. Those three guys right there, I love that. I love what they have right there. Like, I'm not complaining about the guys they signed. They were able to get Juju, who I believe can do a lot of things on the football field that are great. MVS brings great speed. Hardman has improved every year. I still think the Chiefs need that wide receiver one, but the issue with that is getting a wide receiver in the draft and expecting them to produce like a wide receiver one. I feel like is a tall order for a guy in his first year, and you're not always going to get a Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase kind of guy. I think what I really do truly believe is if the Chiefs do get one of these great wide receivers in this year's draft, what's going to happen likely is they're going to kind of slowly ease them into the offense, slowly ease them into more production. And the Chiefs may not have a true wide receiver one on the team this year. I think that's, I don't want to be pessimistic. That might be a possibility. While I do think, like I said, Juju, of all the guys that are there now, has the most talent and most potential to be a wide receiver one. But even if the Chiefs don't have a true wide receiver one this year, I think the depth that they have now, I think is plenty good to help Mahomes disperse the ball. And like I said, you still have Travis Kelce, who for a tight end produces like wide receiver numbers, it feels like every single year. So again, there's a lot of things to be optimistic about with this Chiefs offense. And I think drafting a receiver right now is more than likely just going to help with depth, because like I said, I don't think you can expect a rookie wide receiver to come in and to be a number one guy right out of the gate. It's not a Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase kind of thing. I don't think it's fair expectations and a guy in his first year to be the number one guy. Like, there's very, very rare talent that you can expect a guy to do that. And as much as I think I love Andy Reid, I think Andy Reid could make one of these guys a top receiver. I don't think the expectation of drafting one of these guys, having them come in and be a number one guy, I don't think is an expectation that I think we should have as fans. But we also should be very optimistic about who we do have on the team. And if anything, if Juju does turn out to be a number one wide receiver, then the guy that they do draft, and it's just going to add more depth to a receiving core that I think right now is actually fairly solid. But that was my number two biggest need. Now, some people would have this next one flip, but hear me out. The reason why I have wide receiver as the second biggest need for the Chiefs is for one reason really, and one reason only, and that's because this team runs on the offense. And I think it's been pretty evident ever since Patrick Mahomes became the starter for the Chiefs back in 2018. This team has ran on offense. And so I think because of how much the Chiefs have invested into Patrick Mahomes, because how much faith that they have in the offense, I think building around Patrick Mahomes is a little bit more important than the next position I'm going to be talking about, which the next position, the final position that I think the Chiefs have to address in this year's draft is corner. Now, if you look in the secondary right now, I think it's a fairly solid group. You have Justin Reed, who was a really good signing. You had Juan Thornhill, who I think is really good. You had Rashad Fenton, who had great moments last year. And you have L'Jarius Sneed, who's an absolute playmaker. So the four guys that they have that are starting in the secondary, if the season likely started today, would be those four guys. And if those are the four guys starting for me, I'm not going to be complaining right now. But we're in the same boat with the cornerbacks as we are the wide receivers. I think personally, the way that the Chiefs team is right now, I think the corners and the wide receiver rooms, I think they're in the exact same position. They have tremendous depth. They have great players that could be great role players, great supporting cast guys, but they don't have a number one corner. And ever since Charvarius Ward signed with the 49ers and he wasn't coming back, that obviously left a void in the secondary for the Chiefs. And that's a position they have to go after. I think if they get a number one corner out of this year's draft, then obviously one of those guys like Rashad Fenton, I don't think L'Jarius Sneed, but probably Rashad Fenton would get bumped to the sidelines. But then you look at the depth that the Chiefs will have at the corner position. It would be a really good solid group, especially if they fix the one and the biggest liability that the Chiefs have had this year, which is the defensive line. I think for me personally, when it comes to the defense, I think if they go after defensive line first, it'll fix a whole bunch of issues that are going on with this team. So I personally think, based off this order, the Chiefs need to go after a pass rush number one. They need to go after wide receiver, and second is their second biggest need, and that's because, again, they want to build around Mahomes. They're investing a lot in him. And then third, the only reason why I say cornerback 3 is because the group they have there now is fairly solid. And then if you build a good defensive line, then the secondary isn't going to have that huge burden that it had last year. But those are the biggest needs that I think the Chiefs need to address in this year's draft. What do you think the Chiefs need to address the most in this year's draft? And I'll see you in the next one.